Thank you for the introduction, Carol. Good morning, everybody.
Get everyone woken up.
So I have a little unknown fact about David Meerman Scott that you might not know. David actually has 5 names. David Meerman Benedict Cumberbatch Scott. Did anybody know that? No? Yeah. He obviously dropped that more famous piece, and the whole 140 characters was problematic. So David always is tough to follow and does a great job. So I'd like to first thank Demand Gen Report for hosting us and having us, inviting us here. This is our 3rd year participating with the event. It's been amazing to see how this event has grown over the years, and it's great to have content on that side of the wall and a focus on demand gen on this side of the wall, and it's a pretty unique event if you think about that. So our talk is going to be covering a lot of areas in a short amount of time. So without any further ado, we're gonna get started, and I'll reintroduce my colleague Carrie Rediker.
Hello, everyone. So when you think about back when you first were graduating from college and you were trying to decide what you wanted to do with as your career, what was it that drew you to marketing? What were the motivations to go into it? For me, it was the artistic side, the arts. I love to draw and paint and write and all of those creative aspects of communications and creative design and writing impactful copy, were really what pulled me into it. For others of you, you may have been drawn right off the bat to the technology part of it, the digital evolution, all of those aspects of it. The technology is just exploding. Some of the stats that we see are that in 2012, there were maybe 350 marketing-related technology companies. By 2015, over 2,000. And so, we're obviously consuming this technology, regardless of the reasons that we, decided to go into marketing. We're consuming these technologies in an incredible way. And, it really is an exciting time to be a marketer. We're really able to start to figure out how do we blend these different sides of our right and left brain. Whether you're the really creative aspect or the very technical, we have to figure out how to come together and be more impactful in our approach to marketing. You might have to click, I don't think this one's working. So we're going to break this down into 3 main focus areas. First, we're going to talk about how do we make this shift from activity, and what are some of the drivers around that shift? And then what are some of the myths around this explosion in technology that we need to think about and figure out how we start to better integrate and incorporate all of this exploding technology capabilities? And then finally, we're going to explore the importance of the role of experimentation. And we're going to talk a little bit about how all of this comes together. So starting off, we've all heard the terms quantity over quality and, less is more, focus on impact. All of these in theory sound really great, but actually being able to implement them in many organizations takes a lot of courage. We've in the late 90s to the 2000s, if any of you have been in B2B for any length of time, you know what it feels like to feel that frustration of not having the data, not being able to answer some of the questions that many of our business to consumer peers, ask and answer every day. And, it was a very challenging time. And, as technology started to evolve, the first thing that was addressed was how do we start to track activity and all of this growth? You saw the explosion of the internet, web technologies, marketing automation platforms. And as marketers, this is what we latched onto. We began to have incredible dashboards tracking all of these different activities that we're doing. We are, gone leaps and bounds in the way that we're utilizing marketing automation platforms and content marketing technologies. And, the reality is that to a great degree, we've evolved the way that we do our marketing. We've started, leveraging prospecting so that we can further validate and move our leads through the pipeline and start to get better visibility into the data that we're starting to capture in these forms that we're evolving. And even the vendors and the agencies out there have been very helpful in giving us all of these guides to help us along this journey of implementing that technology.
Yeah, by the way, if anyone has a definitive guide to definitive guides, I would personally love to have that. Lots of good definitive guides out there.
So the next question is, we all feel this pressure and to shift towards trying to show how marketing is impacting the business. How are we really moving the needle? And, making that shift from just these activity-focused dashboards to really how do we begin to get more visibility using all of these technologies, using all of these growing capabilities to answer those questions that, we've been trying to answer for quite some time. So when we think about today, we're almost on the other side of the pendulum where so many technologies have exploded. There's so many dashboards. There's so much data. It makes your head want to explode. What am I supposed to do with all of this data? We're on the other side of it now where, okay, how do we start to make these actionable insights? And, on the one hand, we love that kid in the candy store aspect of all this, shiny technology that we can implement. But how do we really pull it together to be able to tell a clear story of not just marketing's activity, but how are we influencing deals? Not just how we're sourcing it, but how are we helping all the way through to some of the aspects of sales enablement? And if you're in a larger corporation and you're being challenged with the fact that if you've been doing marketing for any length of time, and you've been using any of these technologies, you probably have a pretty robust database that you're trying to mine.
So one of the things that Sirius did and does along the way is produce research. And if you joined us in Nashville last May, you saw this particular study unveiled. This was our 2015 Buyer Insight Study. If any of you have not had a chance to take a look at this report, I will be happy to make it available to you. It's really interesting. This was the first time that we had gone beyond preferences for content, for activity in the buyer's journey, and observed actual behavior. So the study was over 1,000 B2B buyers, over hundreds of buyers' journeys, where we really wanted to understand the content and the tactics that really impact progression along the buyer's journey. So again, if you haven't had a chance to look at this report yet, please get in touch with me. I will make sure you have a copy of it, and it starts to help us kind of tell this story of shifting from activity to impact. So one of the things we're going to do in the talk between Carrie and myself is I'm going to give you examples of what SiriusDecisions as a marketing department is doing to take some of this knowledge and philosophy into practice. So I'm going to be showing you some actual examples of things that we're doing in our own progression to become modern marketers. So this first view is our story of going from activity to impact. So this chart is a report that no doubt many of you are asked to create. It shows the various things you're doing over a period of time. This particular chart happens to be kind of a year-to-date roll-up of all of the different programs and tactics that we've done through December of last year. It's good. We have to understand what this looks like, but it is our view of activity. And as marketers, what we try to do next is we take that activity and start to translate it into meaningful impact. And some of the ways that we do that is we look at our own dashboards and reports, and we start to report on what did those activities create in terms of leads? Where are those leads in the funnel? What tactics, programs, campaigns can we attribute those leads and that impact to? These are good, they're directionally right, but they are still marketing's view of activity and impact. So what I'm going to show you next, and covering up some of the names to protect the innocent, this is a dashboard and a set of reports that is not a marketing view of the world, but this is the business view of the world. This happens to be our sales dashboard. So as we think about being purposeful in doing the right activities that create the right impact, we also have to be purposeful in thinking about how do we use technologies the right way. We're using, as the marketing organization, the sales view of the world to really understand and talk about impact. It's one thing to talk about what we perceive the impact to be. It's another to put it in terms that sales really understands. As most of you know that have tried or are trying to achieve alignment with sales, the margin for error in achieving alignment is extremely thin. So one of the things that we do is we try to take off the table as many things as possible that sales might push back on or reject as fact. So we relate our activity and our impact in their terms, in views, in tools that they're looking at every day. So I can, for example, use that dashboard and show my peers in sales what our contribution to pipeline has been. And by the way, this is current weighted pipeline. It's not the sum total of marketing leads or pipeline that we could look back over a period. It's what's in the active funnel today that we are forecasting to close. So we're talking about the best of marketing's impact when we have these discussions. I can have discussions based on geography and territory. We are oriented for most of our markets in a geography-based model. Some geographies are stronger than others. We can have a discussion down at that level with my sales leaders in various regions. We're increasingly looking at things from an industry perspective, so I want to understand what impact looks like in our industry go-to-market. The same as we think about revenue band. We're starting to see some real meaningful differences in how we work with large market and small organizations. So this is the same data, just told and through different stories, different lenses. But the important thing here, and the piece I really want you to understand, is the purpose for relating impact through these tools with this technology is to really close the gap of credibility for working with sales. And anything that you can do as a marketer to take those barriers off the table will be beneficial in the long run. So that's the next kind of subject that we're going to go into, is this myth of technology and the fact that we oftentimes do technology for technology's sake. But if we think about purpose, we'll start to think about that differently. Hopefully, many of you are old enough to understand what a Rube Goldberg machine is. This is a sample of a Rube Goldberg machine. Really interesting to look at. A Rube Goldberg machine does a really good job of overcomplicating and over-engineering a very simple task. And as it turns out, we as marketers can't take technology that way. And doing technology for technology's sake is that trap that we have to avoid.
So how do we stop perpetuating this myth of technology? SiriusDecisions research shows that over the past 10 years, the majority of the investment in both sales and marketing spend is around, how do they increase technologies that the goal is to increase demand at a grand scale. So if we move beyond this concept and really start to think about how is this being perpetuated, and no offense, we're vendors, other vendors out there, some of us have a tendency to overstate some of the use cases and the application of the technology, and downplay the importance of understanding, having a solid strategy, understanding what integration needs to take place, understanding the realistic use cases that can be applied in different environments. And honestly, as buyers, we are also to blame to some degree because we so desperately want to believe. We get enamored with this shiny object syndrome that we forget to step back and ask the tough questions that relate to our business and the realities of different resource constraints that we might have, different challenges we may have with buy-in from different parts of the business, and the impact that might have on the technology's success. And so when we think about, the possibility of debunking this myth, this is where, our advice to ourselves as a vendor and all of the other vendors is out there, is that as much as you can, really start to evangelize your solution in the context of how you can contribute to business impact. Help all of us marketers out there do some of that due diligence and authentically represent the capabilities and the strategy and the work that your clients will need to take in order to see the success and to really be able to emulate the best practices of some clients that you're seeing using this technology successfully. From the buyer's standpoint, we want to encourage you to make sure that when you are evaluating these technologies, that you're being realistic. What are the trade-offs? There's definitely some trade-offs from a budgeting standpoint, from a spend standpoint, from the resources of your team, the skills that you need to have on hand to be able to fully integrate and leverage the capabilities. And so really stepping back and being honest with ourselves. So SiriusDecisions developed this process of a lens of how to evaluate technology. How do we begin to get that information and understand the decisions that need to be made and the hard questions that we do need to be asking? How do we take into consideration those integration and the insight points that could potentially impact the viability of the technology? And then how do we begin to, most importantly, interpret this information? And the end goal is to narrow it down to where we get to the true impact. And so as we look through this lens, it's a lens of specificity. So we become more detailed as we go through this process with the goal of increasing our results and the outcomes and, really be able to get to that point where we have impact at scale. So we not only have the volume of activity, but we're also able to measure and make key decisions on how that volume is impacting our potential business.
So the second example I'm going to walk through is our journey to reach persona marketing, audience-based persona marketing. It's been about a 2-year journey for us. We've had our current version of persona marketing in market for about a year. I'm going to walk through, using that lens, how we began to look at those different layers, the information, the requirements, the integration, interpreting that information, and ultimately our decision to move to personas, not because we had all of the technology available to do it, but because we were convinced that that would have a real impact on the business. So in our journey to activate personas, we had to answer a lot of questions. The first question was, how many discernible personas do we have available to take to market? And we landed on a number, 19 personas that we have currently in market. We rolled those out over about a 3-phased approach with the initial 10, the following 5, and then the last 4. And we now have 19 active personas. We had to determine as a company and as a department, how many can we support? At what depth of persona marketing are we going to be able to execute well? Understand the preferences, because our audience and our personas have considerable overlap, to understand what is unique about those personas in terms of their preferences. We had to understand what assets, what content, what offers we already had in place to be able to activate those personas, and what new content we would need to create to do that. We had to understand what's different as we think about clients versus active prospects versus companies and individuals that have perhaps no awareness of the SiriusDecisions brand. So we had to kind of rationalize a number of different things to determine what this should look like for us. As we thought about all of the tools and technology in our stack that we could apply, and this is an important part, instead of starting with what's on the right side and understanding how to use it, what we wanted to do was be very stepwise, go through the process to understand how we would leverage these tools to accomplish specific goals. We wanted to understand behavior. We have ways of understanding behavior through certain systems that helped inform what the persona profiles looked like. That helped drive deeper segmentation. It helped us draw some boundaries in some cases between where one persona starts and one stops. We wanted to correlate what we thought about these personas with what the data actually showed. We have a number of tools that are kind of in the direction of business intelligence and analytics that we wanted to kind of bounce off those tools, bounce off the data, what we thought with what the data actually showed. And then we wanted to use all that as we thought about going to market in terms of how do we best take everything that we know into our inbound and outbound programs. And so as we went through that process, you can see that we checked almost every box, literally every box on this slide for our tools and technology. But the direction that we went was, again, with the purpose in mind and the business objective first. As we thought about interpreting what we found, there was a number of things that we saw that we could now start doing. For example, we wanted to create persona fields in both our CRM and marketing automation databases. Persona was now a meaningful attribute that we could key off of and have as a meaningful part of our segmentation programs. We were accumulating certain third-party data that we wanted to append to contact records. This was going to let us serve better, more contextual offers at the right time or at a better time. And as Carrie mentioned, the phones have always been an important part of what we do, and we were a bit disconnected in terms of our ability to coordinate at deeper levels and really have the story continue from what we were telling as marketers into the inside sales and outside sales teams. And so an integrated approach to delivering that message was made possible. So we've had this in our current version, I say, in market for about a year. The early returns are quite positive. We've had an increase of lead volume at about 15% compared to when we, prior to personas being activated. But more important than that are how these leads are converting. We're seeing many more of these persona-based, persona-driven demand converting into pipeline. That's SQL for us. And the leads that are being created in this manner are advancing more quickly than those that are not. So this is overall goodness for us. We're going to continue to take this to the next level as we mature our persona initiatives further. And our last
So now let's
point.
explore experimentation. So I have a question for all of you. How many of you have championed a big initiative and you rolled it out on a great scale and it was a huge failure because you didn't take the time to pilot it? And I'm guessing at some level, whether it was a technology implementation or trying some new big initiative that may have cost a lot of money from your budget, we have all had those experiences or been in some way involved in them. And so we can't downplay the importance of taking the time to do these pilots and really think differently about how we look at experimentation and that scientific side of our job and the science that we are being pushed to apply to the way that we look at marketing. So I'm going to share with you an interesting principle. So Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize winner in the 60s, and he had this great quote that we are the easiest ones to fool, so we need to be very careful that we don't do that. So when we think about his role, I mean, he's one of the most noted scientists in the world. In fact, he was brought in to serve on a commission to evaluate a tragic accident that happened. And in fact, he deemed that accident as one rooted in history. And so I'll start with this example. And a couple of weeks ago, around January 28th, we celebrated the 20-year anniversary of the space shuttle explosion. Shortly after takeoff from Cape Canaveral, it was this tragic event. And, the nation was stunned, and we asked these questions of, how could this happen? There are teams of actual rocket scientists, doing the testing and the experiments, and, how could it have launched and allowed something like this to happen? And as Feynman and the team of investigators began to unravel what took place during this tragedy, what they discovered was it's the crux of so many issues. There was a lack of alignment and communication between the NASA engineers and the NASA managers. And what the NASA engineers thought was a 1% likelihood of this disaster being able to occur, the engineers saw it as 1 in 100,000th of a 1%. So, just the scale is so different. But the reality was they weren't communicating in a way that the managers that were making the decisions on launch could understand and make the right decisions. In fact, when they would look at the data, there was this culture that had been established to not ask hard questions. If data was not consistent with their plan of launching, they would figure out ways to explain it away or just flat out ignore that data. And we all know what the end result was. It brings up two good points. One is that there's this statement by Stalin that talks about that, we don't respond viscerally to statistics. Especially in this day and age, we have to figure out a way to convey the analysis and the data and this experimentation that we're doing in a way that resonates with people. And sometimes it can be, simple shifts in the way that we translate numbers, how we associate with them with things that people can relate to, that allow them then to make the right decisions when they're looking at it. So, a simple example of just taking that percentage from a decimal point into real numbers, all of a sudden you begin to get a better sense of the scale that was involved in the discrepancy between the data that these managers and scientists were looking at. And so, we're not expecting all of us to, have the same pressures on us, obviously, that the NASA engineers and managers had, but, we're definitely not all rocket scientists. But, how do we take some of those lessons and, really take it to heart? I mean, Feynman was a very well-respected author. He was a respected professor. And, I think the most important thing that we can take away from this example, even though it is a bit morbid, is that we all have to be willing to create a culture and an environment within our organizations where people are comfortable asking questions. They're comfortable taking chances and experimenting and, building that environment of experimentation.
So on a slightly less somber note, this is a view of several of our current initiatives that we have going on in marketing at SiriusDecisions. And what I would encourage you to think about as you think about what your list looks like is how might you start to bring a more scientific approach, a more experimentation into these initiatives. I'm going to highlight an example that I think sets up well to kind of discuss with those principles. But first, a quick primer. The scientific method, if you don't remember from 5th grade, maybe, has 6 parts. The first is you have to come up with the question that you want to ask, something that you're curious about. You have to do enough background research that you can design the experiment. Before you design that experiment, you want to assert a hypothesis. This is something that you really want to prove out in the experiment. You're going to test that hypothesis by doing the experiment. Once the experiment is done, you're going to analyze that data and draw some conclusions, and then you're going to communicate your results. So the experiment that we've done fairly recently is really how we use paid media in our annual demand campaign. Our demand campaigns have about a 12-month runtime. They are fiscal year in length. And so this fiscal year for us will be wrapping up at the end of March. So I'm about a year into the Outperform campaign. We've been using paid media for about the last 6 months. And so what I wanted to do with our experiment is apply a smarter approach and test a hypothesis with paid media to see its impact on our campaign efforts. So again, I've highlighted this earlier, but we're doing this across 19 personas. It's a very integrated, multi-channel approach. With respect to paid media, we wanted to design an experiment specifically where we could test and hypothesize about the role that third-party intent data might play in our paid media. So this data is being called, by the way, how many of you are currently using third-party intent data, whether it's called buyer intent data or behavioral intent data? Anybody using that, experimenting with that? Okay, so you're where we were about 6 months ago. It's a really cool thing that's out there. It's also in that trap of doing it without an objective in mind can be perilous. What we wanted to do was design an experiment where we could really test the merits of this third-party data. So we took what I would call that flipped funnel approach, an account-based marketing approach, We have about 10,000 accounts that we have scored using an account scoring algorithm that we feel comfortable saying are in our target market. What I wanted to do was use a subset of that. I looked at the best per score, 1,500 accounts. And with those 1,500 accounts, I put those in two groups. The first group was going to have behavioral data associated with the paid media campaign. The second group was not. Everything else that I did is, in terms of the experiment, what we tried to do is take out as many variables as possible so that we could really just test the impact of the intent data. So for example, the creative and the ads were identical across both sides. The campaigns were run on two different platforms. We actually worked with two different providers to do this. And so I'll walk you through some of the data and some of the results and what we learned from this experiment. So the group with data and the group without data were served a lot of ads over the course of about a 6-month period. And they totaled exactly, statistically, the same number of impressions, 130,000 impressions. That first data point, and not looking at these conversion rates, but really understanding the difference it made in click-through rate. And as those clicks were converting to conversions, conversions for us are a form fill. So I can get a click to a form and a form completed. And in our case, that resulted in significantly higher form conversion. And so the outcome of this simple experiment as a part of our overall demand campaign was quite simple. We're going to use more third-party data as we go forward in the rest of this year and into my fiscal year 17 in our campaign effort. So to summarize, the 3 big points that we really wanted to leave you with today were to think differently about some of these things. Think differently about impact and making that shift from activity to impact. Think differently about technology and how you make decisions to use and leverage technology. Start with a business driver. Think purposefully about applying technology to achieve the results that you start out to achieve. And think differently about being more scientific. I gave you a really short, simple, straightforward example. We're going to try to pull more of that thinking and more of that process into some of those other projects that I highlighted.
So in summary, the theme of this was really just to get you thinking about how do we start to ask some of those tough questions and really begin to focus on impact over activity. And SiriusDecisions views the ultimate goal is to find a balance between the traditional, more creative aspects of our marketing profession and in balancing those with this explosion that's happening with the more scientific side and the pressures that we are all feeling to become more scientific marketers.
I wanted to just leave with one quick thought. Carrie mentioned at the top that this is, and in my opinion, I see it, and hopefully you do too, it's a very exciting time to be marketers. We have never had of tools and technology and availability of data like we have today, never before. At the same time, what's interesting is never has the bar been higher for authentic communications from brands. Buyers crave and demand authenticity. And so we have all this stuff on one side that are going to let us do things more efficiently and more scientifically, but if we don't get the authenticity piece right, we will be doing technology for technology's sake. So our theme for this year in our campaign efforts as well as our summit is the art and science. And how do you balance and do both well? How do you get authenticity right while also doing it intelligently, taking advantage of all that science has to offer? So that's our talk. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
And again, if anyone is interested in that buyer study, come see either one of us, and we'll get your email and figure out how to get that to you.
Thanks. Let's give it up again for Brad and Carrie. Great job. Thanks so much.